Welcome to Our Voices, Hastings State Hospital. This is a project that is mutually put on by Dakota County Historical Society and the Hastings Community TV. We're pleased to be here, and we wouldn't be able to be here, of course, without a grant that we received from the Legacy Fund distributed by the Minnesota Historical Society. Our project is gathering stories from people who worked at one time in some function at the Hastings State Hospital. We've also been interested in getting the other side of that story, the voices from the people who actually lived at the state hospital and who were the people who received the care and were there, and that was their home. We haven't been able to find people to discuss their experiences, and we're still interested in doing that. The Hastings State Hospital opened in 1900, and the first residents were 100 men who came on a special train from the Rochester State Hospital, and the basic precept would be that these men would be located and just taken care of, their needs would be met, and it would be a custodial care. There were no programs or anything else except for the custodial care for that. That changed a lot through the years, and the history of the hospital spans from 1900 to May 1st of 1978 when it closed. So today we're going to be talking to Jeanne McGree, and welcome, Jeanne. I'm happy that you're here with us to share your experiences at the state hospital. Could you tell us a little bit about how you first started working there?
Well, I was always interested in the state hospital because my mother had been an employee there for many years, prior to the time that I went to work in my middle age. And I went to work when the state put reimbursement offices in each of the state residential facilities in order to get Medicare help. To get the state reimbursed for the patient's care, for those who were unable to pay or had no means to pay. And we could bill Medicare for their care at that time. So reimbursement officers and then a secretary were put into all of the state residential facilities, and we did interviews to get them certified for that kind of care and get the state reimbursed.
And so, tell us about you heard about the job and went and applied for it, or how did it?
Yes. My husband had been hospitalized, and I had been working at 3M, and I could have gone back there, but I decided, because I lived on the end of town, that I could walk to work across the bridge at the hospital, and that was a very nice, welcome thing for me to do. And I went to work in the reimbursement office, and frankly, I was kind of frightened about working among patients that had mental illness and problems that I didn't know a lot about at the time. But I could tell immediately they were well taken care of, and knowing that my mother had worked there. And
yeah, tell us a little bit about your mother working there. You were an adult at that time?
Yes, I was an adult, and I wasn't living in Hastings at the time. But my mother worked there for many years as a psych tech. She had been a school teacher, and after we all got out of school, she went there to work. And at that time, there was a farm on the grounds, and of course, many of the people that were residents were rural people, and the residents loved the farm, and they picked strawberries and sweet corn and even milk cows, I was told. And my mother would take them for walks on the grounds. They always had beautiful grounds, and most of them didn't walk into Hastings, although they could if they wanted to. They could come to the creamery or into town, but they were well taken care of, except I can recall that my mother was there at a time when they still used restraints on some of the people who were harder to adapt to the situation. and that was always troubling. But that did, the restraints were taken off, and patients' rights things were
that changed.
Came into play at the time she worked there.
Sure.
So that
she was
good.
Probably pleased to see that change.
Yes.
And so, going back to your experience, you had a little bit of an apprehension, but you got over that, and you adapted to the job. What types of things would you do on a typical day? What would your job entail?
The reimbursement officer, my boss, would interview people, and many of them had exhausted their hospitalization insurance in private sanatoriums or hospitals. And many places didn't have, like even the Hastings Hospital didn't have facilities for mental illness. And then there were also the chemical dependency people that were in a unit across the street, and a youth treatment center too. And within the hospital there was also a geriatric ward and a mentally retardation ward, where they had nurses and qualified people to care for them. They had nice day programs, and they had a recreational type director, and they'd have music, and they'd have singing and entertainment of kinds for the residents. And
so I'd like to just back up a little bit, because you started working right when Medicare was implemented, and it was going to be the way that the state hospital facility was reimbursed for caring for all these people. Do you have any idea, before Medicare started, where did the money come from at that time? Was it just typically through the state legislature? Would it have been just funded through the state of Minnesota? And so
I believe that's the way it was. I think that the Department of Public Welfare had a responsibility to care for the aged and the elderly or the infirm, whatever. And I think some of the people were committed mentally ill people, but there was a geriatric ward where I often thought that these people, well, maybe today we'd call it Alzheimer's. I mean, they probably had some memory issues or something like that. But I think the state at that time was committed to caring for the people.
Them. What if people came in there and their families or they themselves had resources of their own? Would they have to pay their own way before Medicare came on board, or aren't you sure about that?
Well, no, I'm really not sure about that. But
I just think it's interesting.
I think after age 21, I think that was the age of majority at that time, where now it would be maybe 18 years old. But at that time, I think that the family wasn't responsible, and of course these people were unable to work and support themselves.
So it would have been the state
I think the state took care of them, just like they did, the people who were in their own homes.
Sure. So when this started, pardon me, I'm sorry, I'm just sort of trying to get an idea of this. So Medicare came into being, and it was voted in, and so all of this changed.
Yes.
And were you there right away when they started this at the state hospital?
I believe I was. It was, I think there were about 500 to 600 residents out there at that time at the state hospital, and I think that 200 or 300 of them were eligible for Medicare because they were over 60, 65, whatever the age was. So we had to
that was a lot of work, wasn't it?
Yes,
getting everyone signed up and getting all that paperwork
place over a period
done
of time, and then as residents came in to the hospital, new residents came in, then we'd do the reimbursement officer would do an interview with them and see if they had any sources of income to help pay for their care. If not, it was deferred. They were given a price per day, and that fee was deferred until the time of their death or until the time that they could pay for it. So many of them.
But if they couldn't pay for it in the meantime, Medicare was paying for it?
Well, if they were eligible for Medicare, yes. If they were maybe in their 30s or 40s, I'm not sure, but maybe the younger people
But there was Medicaid too, or wasn't that
Yeah,
part of it?
I really am not sure about
Oh,
that.
okay.
And some of the people that would fit into this category were maybe people that came into the chemical dependency unit. They may have been working people or
Sure.
more in the 30 to 50 year age group and probably not eligible for Medicare.
Sure.
So I think they would, I really don't know if the county contributed anything for them or not, but the state
So,
could bill them for their care.
so during the day, you would get there in the morning, and then what would be sort
Yes,
of the
yes.
routine that you would do?
Yes, and
What was the routine like
well,
through the day?
well, if we had people coming in to be interviewed, but I think there was always a backlog of if, for instance, a person came in that had insurance and should have been able to pay, and then the insurance would have been denied many times because many insurance companies wouldn't pay for mental illness, and many insurance companies wouldn't pay for chemical dependency treatment.
Okay.
And I would type letters to these insurance companies, and we recovered a lot of money because I can recall quoting many times, especially for the chemically dependent people, that Medicare made alcoholism or chemical dependency an illness in 1958. According to the American Medical Society, it is an illness, and that they had to pay, and very often that did the trick.
Really?
So,
Wow.
so we did recover from insurance companies. So my job was all of this typing and correspondence with
Sure.
with the insurance companies, and I think we always, you know, some of the Medicare billing was kind of cumbersome and took a
Yes.
while. So there wasn't a time when we weren't busy, but we had the lunchroom or the canteen at noon, and we'd taught in the next to our office were many of the social workers' offices, and sometimes we'd consult with them about the resident, or you know, if at some future time they thought they'd be getting out and able to take care of some of their billing.
Sure.
But so there was a lot of interaction with the rest of the staff in the hospital, and I can recall Mr. Brunsgaard, who was the administrator at that time, having a sort of a safety meeting or in-service training thing for us, and for people who were not at ease with dealing with mental patients. He said, you know, don't be afraid of them. He said the incidents that happen with injuries or patients getting out of hand in a state hospital are much less than that on the streets of Minneapolis, for instance. He used as a
Oh, that's
as
interesting.
a instance, but the patients were mostly very mellow, and of course they were.
When you would do those safety, were they sort of like what we call fire drills, those types of things, or was it?
I
mean,
don't
like
recall fire drills.
how to
but
get out
I'm
of
sure,
the building or something
I'm sure
like
the
that?
residents had to go through that because there were kind of outdoor tunnels, not tunnels,
Oh, fire escape.
fire escapes on the
Sure.
outside of the building where they would go down some pole or something like
Yeah,
that.
because they had those
And
tall
yes,
buildings,
and I think,
three-story.
and they had their resident dining room, and there was a lot of
Did they have an
activity.
employee dining room too then, where you ate? or
No,
were,
no, we'd have to, well, some of the people brought lunches, and some ate in the canteen. They sold
okay.
sandwiches and things in the
You were-
canteen.
You were telling me a little bit about that canteen before we went on the air. I think that's an interesting, about the canteen's operation. Would you like to talk a little
Tom Rafferty was the one, and it was the Society for the Blind that really ran the canteens, I think, in all of the state hospitals and in some of the public buildings up at the Capitol. I know the Centennial Building is where he went after that, after the hospital talked to closing.
So did they
But-
prepare food there too then?
Yes, yes, they made hamburgers, and they sold Cokes and coffee and ice cream treats and, you know, candy bars, and thing, and I think even magazines and things of that sort.
Okay. What was it set up like? What was it like? A little store, a little
Well,
restaurant?
they had booths and tables and things, and it was centrally located. And there was also a library there. Margaret Olson was the librarian there, a Hastings lady for many years, and they had a wealth of a good.
Could the patients check books out and
Yes,
stuff
the
then?
patients could, and they also had Dr. Coppice used to come out with his assistant Mary Stevens, and they had dental care at the hospital, and then of course they had the doctor's offices there where patients were seen. And we didn't become involved with that area of it, but I know it was available to the patients. And I think basically the patients were well treated there. In fact, I was, at the time when they closed the state hospitals, I felt badly for some of these patients because they had spent most of their life there, and that was home to them.
Sure.
And they could go home on visits regularly or Christmas or whatever if they had a relative or someone who would sign them out and take them. And so I think they had kind of a nice secure life there, where after they were put into private boarding homes and things of that sort in the Twin Cities, many of them became street people, because I knew personally and saw people that would come in as what we would now call bag ladies into the state buildings. When I later worked up at the Capitol, they'd come into the buildings just to get warm, and some with no coats on.
And did you recognize some of them
I
as
did.
former patients?
I recognized one woman walking down University Avenue one day when I looked out the window with no coat on, and it was winter.
And it was one of the former
And she was one of the former residents that I knew well there.
Oh, that's sad.
And they'd wander in and out of our office, and if they ever knew that I was Mrs. Miller's daughter, they loved me immediately. So some of them got word of that. And I have to tell you, this is kind of humorous. Many of the residents would come in the office where we worked, and we always just talked.
Now, is this at the hospital?
At
or
the
is this
hospital.
Okay.
No, at the hospital.
Okay.
They'd have time on their hands, and they'd come in the office, and some of them would ask me, do you have any gum in your purse? Some would ask if I had any cigarettes. and I was kind of forewarned that, you know, if you start doing for them, they'll be back every day. And of course that did happen, but some of them would come in just that remembered my mother very well, and they'd come in to talk. Or if you wore a certain kind of perfume or something, some of the women residents would want me to share that with them. But they were all they were treated humanely and nicely, and I always felt that that it was a secure place for them.
Sure.
They felt like it was home after so many years,
Yes.
and and I'm sure some of them did well on the outside too, but
Once
I
they
know
get-
there were some that didn't.
Well, now, you grew up in Hastings. Around,
Most, yes,
you
yes,
went
from
to
grade school on.
Grade
yes,
school on.
1940.
And so you lived in town, and you always knew about the state hospital. Do you have any remembrances, memories of what the impression of the state hospital was to the residents?
Well,
when
you know, sadly, people didn't understand mental illness at that time, and it's still hard to comprehend some of those diseases, but mental illness was almost untalked about subject.
Sure.
If you had someone in your family that had mental illness, they were crazy, is the slang terms, and people even referred to the place as the crazy house or the nut house or something like that. And frankly, you know, we didn't know the depths of the sadness of that illness of schizophrenia. And before the mind-bending drugs came into play, and I believe it was in the 50s, where nowadays people can recover and through the use of certain drugs and be over their spell of illness and back
Their
to work.
symptoms recede.
Yes, with treatment. So it was sad in those days because nobody really understood, and a family was almost all considered, well, you know, and some mental illness tends to be hereditary. I guess they don't say it is, but it tends to be.
So do you think because of that lack of information and awareness that there was some insensitivity
absolutely,
towards the residents? And
absolutely, and I'm thinking, like, you know, especially among the younger people, I think they were probably made fun of or you know, harassed or maybe even bullied. Who knows? But I know that and you know, I felt like you know, my mother was kind of a learned person, but we still didn't talk about or didn't know much about mental illness because it hadn't affected our family personally, but it affected many families and was very, very sad.
You mentioned a little thing about the lunch hour, the kids driving around at lunch.
Yes, in high school. It was so sad when I think back on it. Many of the farm kids had vehicles to drive because I think in those days they could get a license to drive before, and of course women didn't drive at all or didn't have any driver's ed in the schools. But the farm kids and some of the town kids too had vehicles, and for just, you know how the kids refer to taking a whip up and down Vermilion Street and this and that. Well, we'd take a whip out to the state hospital, and I can remember driving through the grounds there and just laughing about some of the actions of the people that would maybe going through some certain contortions, you know, or just in a way making fun of those people and maybe calling out the windows to them and waving at them, and we weren't being respectful, and I just can't imagine how I ever did such a thing, and we knew so little about it, but it was just a time-killing thing that we did on lunch hours once in a while.
Insensitive because you weren't really aware
had no
of what
idea.
that behavior might cause the pain to these people.
That's right, yeah, and there were a few cases that were extreme. I can remember most of them were pretty gentle and peaceful type people that would be more in a state of depression and not too active. But there were some people that actually would be so active that I can recall one girl would actually jump off of a chest of drawers or highboy and injure herself. And of course, she was the type of patient that would have to be watched closely. And they weren't allowed to have scissors or sharp needles or things, but they had other activities that they tried to keep them busy and entertained and you know, showered and clean but some people that would come in there, I can remember my mother talking about people that would come in as new residents when she worked there. And this is just sad to say, but at one time, she and another aide had to pick maggots off of a person because they had been living in some kind of destitute situation in a state of depression, and until they got help for them, this person had all kinds of unfavorable things. Right. And so they had to be cleaned and made safe and presentable, and the state hospitals did that, and I suppose they were budgeted at a minimum, and I think they did a good job for a lot of people, and it was a safe it was a safe situation.
So once you got there, you really learned that there was nothing to fear, and that it was
absolutely. And Mr. Brunsgaard said in that keeping yourself safe training session, he said, just you know, if you're ill at ease, get behind a chair or have a chair or something between you and the resident, and that would keep you safe most likely. But very few incidents of injury were caused in state hospitals, and of course it was at that time that the movie One Flew Over the Cuckoo Nest became so popular, and that was taken in an Oregon State Hospital, I believe, and and I think, you know, it was somewhat true to life. Although I don't know if there were any unpleasant nurses.
I was going to say, did you have a nurse Ratchet out there?
No, but I think most of the people were pretty compassionate with the residents there, and I always felt like I worried for them to go out into the Twin Cities and be placed in homes, and I'm sure for some it was the right thing, and for some that place was home.
At the time, they believed it was the right thing to do.
Yes,
the best thing. So.
Because people who were committed there in those days so often were there for a lifetime. Once they were there, they most of them spent their whole life.
Well, they didn't really start with much of the treatment where they would do group therapy or anything like that until the 60s. You know, we've been hearing that. So.
And the only thing they did was that electric shock treatment, and that was, I think, if the patient was more agitated or
severely depressed. I heard.
Yes. Or could become violent or something like that.
Well, Jeanne, you have a lot of information about the hospital.
It's a place that I know it was an eye-opener for me, and as I said, I went home every night feeling lucky because you know you're not in that situation.
Right.
But I have a lot of compassion for mental illness since then, because it's nothing they caused or nothing. It's in your genes or chromosomes or the lack of a certain gene or chromosome, and I don't really understand it myself, but I know that they say it's devastating to a marriage situation, and that it comes on, like schizophrenia usually comes on in late adolescence. And so sometimes even in the military, they're washed out of the military for those reasons, because they can't stand the pressure or whatever, but they don't seem to ever know what really causes, you know, because some people live with a lot of pressures and can seem to handle it, but it is just a tragic thing in a family. It's very hard to understand and to cope with the different types of
and
mental
especially
illnesses.
when you you know, it's your loved one and you have to watch them suffer like that.
But I think that the state hospital system was a good one at the time, and I always think about the Hastings State Hospital. Representative Tex Sieben was our representative at that time, and I know that when the hospital closed, that all of the people were grandfathered into jobs up in the Capitol complex at their same rate of pay. So even if it, for instance, the librarian didn't get a job in the library, but she got a job somewhere doing
something else at
her same rate
level.
of pay. So we're like Rochester. I always understood when that hospital closed, the residents, or the employees, I should say, were just laid off. They were without work. And
so I can't remember now. Were you there when the hospital closed?
No, I left like in '73.
Okay, so, and then you went to work for the state somewhere else.
Yes. I was hired by Arlen Erdahl in the Secretary of State's office.
Oh, okay.
I worked with elections there for a couple of years, and then Joan Groh defeated Arlen Erdahl in the '74 election when it was sort of time for a woman, constitutional officer. So I worked there for many years.
So I remember you working
till I retired.
Talking about working for Joan Groh.
And that was very interesting.
And you started out there what year? I'm sorry.
1970.
Oh, in 70. Okay.
Yes.
So you
70 to 73. Sometime I don't remember the exact months, but I was there like three.
Well, and then with your mother's experience too, you did have more years of awareness.
I went with her many times when we were home on leave from the military. She'd go out there to pick up her paycheck, and she'd show me around and talk to the patients, and because she'd take some vacation when we were home, and so I got to know. And I think they did a good job there, and I think there were a lot of wonderful people, and
well, we've been hearing how the staff supported each other and had had nice relationships with each other.
yes,
So.
and then they had a resident chaplain, Father Begot was there,
Yeah.
and he was very good with the residents.
Sure.
And in
So,
fact, some of
yeah.
the public came to Mass out there and to
okay.
church services.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
they were treated well, and the different Legion and the VFW and those organizations would have bingo nights and bring cake and treats out there for the residents, and
Sure.
it was quite
Well,
a
it
nice,
was quite an institution,
Yes.
and it was very important to Hastings, and I
Yes.
really appreciate you coming over this afternoon, because it's a really interesting perspective to find out about the changing with funding and reimbursement. It's an angle that we don't always think about.
I think they were when we moved to Hastings in the early 1940s, I believe they said the population of Hastings was like 5,000, but that included, it was 3,000 and some odd, maybe 3,500, but with the state hospital it was
Like there were
5,000, so
Yeah.
there must have been a lot of residents
in the
there.
40s there were 1,000,
Yeah.
give or take, you know, sometimes
Yes,
a little more.
a huge amount of people
Yes, it
that
really
were
was.
served there, and I think they were probably well served for the times.
Well,
and
I'm sure we've been hearing that. We haven't heard from patients yet, so it would be interesting to get their
Yes,
perspective. But
yes,
thank
and-
you again for coming today.
Well, I'm
and
just real happy
visiting
to
with
share
us,
that
so
experience.
Good.
It was an eye opener and really a very nice experience for me.
Good. All right.
Thank you.
And thank you for joining us, and be sure to tune in. The series is not over. We have many other people that we have been, that you will be watching in the future. So thank you.